The first sound Elias Cain heard when the chains dragged across the steel floor was not the jeer of the alien captains, nor the hiss of the ventilation shafts, but his own laugh. A broken human cuffed and paraded like a trophy should not have been laughing. Yet the sound echoed through the chamber like a challenge, sharp enough to slice through the humid reek of alien breath. The laughter made them pause, all these towering beasts who had conquered star systems and pulverized fleets. And then Elias tilted his head, eyes glinting with a kind of stubborn amusement, and asked the one question no slave was ever supposed to ask. "So, which one of you geniuses is in charge of polishing my chains when I am done with them?" The chamber roared with confusion before it roared with laughter. Captain Gorgth, scales gleaming crimson under the lights, leaned forward on his tusked jaw and jabbed one claw toward the human. "Weakling," he bellowed. "Humanity is the galaxy's joke." The others chortled, slapped their armored thighs, and made comments about his frail bones and soft flesh. One suggested he could be used as a toothpick. Another proposed he would make a better soup stock than soldier. The laughter swelled like a storm, and still Elias smiled, lips cracked, eyes refusing to drop to the floor. He had seen humiliation enough on Earth. What unsettled them was that he refused to play his role in their theater. He had been dragged from one ship to another, shackled so tight the iron bruised his skin. Yet, as they displayed him like an exotic animal, he noticed how desperate they were for amusement. It was not about him at all. It was about themselves, their hollow need to ridicule in order to feel powerful. He leaned into that need, tossing out one-liners like shrapnel. When a captain mocked his lungs for lacking secondary sacs, Elias coughed dramatically and wheezed. "Then perhaps I will donate mine to charity when I am done." The gathered captains blinked at him, uncertain if they were insulted or amused, before breaking into another round of laughter that sounded uncomfortably strained. Inside, Elias knew the stakes. If he faltered, if he showed even an ounce of despair, they would crush him with their claws and laugh as he bled. But if he kept laughing, if he kept twisting the spotlight, he could buy time. What do you think, at that moment, what should he have done? Time was all he needed because he had heard rumors even before his capture. A signal had been whispered about among Earth survivors, a coded transmission that would be sent only once on a frequency so ancient and obscure that the alien empires would dismiss it as static. The moment he had been brought aboard and felt the faint tremor of the comms bay, he knew they would hear it soon. As the feast of mockery continued, Elias's body trembled with exhaustion, but his mind sharpened. The aliens poured glowing liquor into vats and made toasts about Earth's collapse. They tried to provoke him into tears, into begging. Instead, he told them stories. He told them how humans once fought wars over chicken sandwiches, how politicians argued about the shape of bananas. He told them how humanity laughed in the face of tragedy because laughter was the last weapon no empire could confiscate. Some captains laughed because they thought it was ridiculous. A few frowned, sensing something beneath the surface they could not quite name. Then it happened. The ship's comm system flickered. The drunken songs faltered. Through the static came a pulse, faint but deliberate, like the heartbeat of a sleeping beast. The aliens cocked their heads, muttering about interference, about solar winds. The Crimson Captain waved it off with a sneer, declaring it noise from a dying planet. But Elias's grin stretched wider, wider than it had all night, and in that instant, the room chilled. The human was supposed to be broken, but the signal had lit something in his eyes. A silent understanding that he was not alone. He lowered his voice just loud enough for those near him to hear and said, "That is the sound of your nightmare knocking." The words slithered through the chamber more effectively than any roar. Captains shifted in their seats, claws tapping nervously against the metal. One muttered about the ghost of Sol, a rumor dismissed by most as legend. Another argued that Earth's fleets had been destroyed years ago. But Elias said nothing more, letting the silence do the work, watching as doubt rippled through their ranks. The Crimson Captain slammed his fist against the table to break the unease. He ordered Elias dragged back into the pit of beasts to remind him of his station. Chains rattled as guards yanked him away, their laughter shaky but still sharp. Elias did not resist. He shuffled along the deck with mocking grace, pausing to bow to the nearest captain as though he were greeting a dinner guest. It was ridiculous, pathetic even, but it made them hesitate because they could not tell if the joke was on him or them. Thrown into the pit, Elias stared at the creature across from him, a hulking predator bred for war games. The alien crowd jeered, confident that the fragile human would be torn apart. Yet Elias remembered the signal, remembered the partner who had sworn never to leave him behind. He whispered into the air as though she could hear him across the void. "Come find me, Mirror. They think I am theirs, but you and I know better." He looked up at the jeering captains, blood already seeping where the chains had cut his wrists raw, and smiled one more time, because laughter, he knew, was the last thing they expected to fear, and the signal was only the beginning. "Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Whispers of Time channel. Before we start, I hope you subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so that you receive all the new content, and also share the story with your friends so it reaches as many people as possible. And if you have a story, write it in the comments. Maybe we'll choose one to narrate in the next video. Let's start the story. Pay attention, because there's a small detail that might change your entire perspective and awareness of life. The legends were whispered in the farthest corners of alien fleets, passed around by low-ranking crew who swore they had seen ships vanish without a trace, patrols cut down by shadows, or supply lines disrupted with surgical precision. They called it the Ghost of Soul. The senior captains laughed at the stories, claiming humans lacked the intelligence or technology to mount such feats. To them, Earth was a burnt-out ember, its people scattered like dust in the wind. But still the rumors lingered, growing more elaborate with every telling. And as Elias Cain sat chained in the pit, bloody but unbowed, he noticed how quickly the captains had silenced their laughter when the signal broke through. He filed it away like a weapon. Fear lived here, even if they would not admit it. The alien who had mocked him most loudly the night before now avoided his gaze, muttering about comm interference and faulty systems. Another swore the static had carried a pattern too deliberate to be coincidence. They argued in hisses, their tusks clacking, their claws tapping against steel, but none dared look directly at the human for too long. Elias smirked as he sat against the wall, chains cutting into his ankles. He didn't need to speak. Silence was louder than words now, and his silence was fuel to their doubts. That night, when the guards dragged him back to the holding cell, he lay on the cold floor, staring at the ceiling vents. The hum of the ventilation masked whispers, but Elias had learned to listen for the subtle gaps in sound, the faint distortions no one else noticed. There it was again, a flicker of static folded into the airflow. He closed his eyes and listened harder, and then, in the space between heartbeats, he heard her. The voice was faint, tiny from compression, but unmistakable. "Elias, are you alive?" It was Mirror Solari, his partner, the one the aliens believed dead years ago. His chest tightened, not from despair, but from relief sharp enough to cut. Mera always did know how to slip through cracks no one else could see. He tilted his head toward the vent and whispered back, barely moving his lips. "Still chained, still ugly as ever. You sound disappointed." There was a pause, and then her laugh. The same low, sardonic laugh that had carried him through 100 hopeless battles. "Disappointed? Elias, I'm impressed you're not already a puddle on the floor." He grinned despite the bruises. "If they kill me, it'll be from boredom, not claws, not lasers, just their speeches." The thought made her chuckle again, and for a brief moment, the chains around his wrists felt lighter. Mera explained quickly. The signal had been theirs, a fragment of a much larger plan. She had faked her death to disappear from alien tracking systems, building networks in the shadows, gathering the remnants of Earth survivors into a force nimble enough to strike, but small enough to evade. She had been watching Elias's capture unfold, waiting for the right moment to reveal herself. He was the bait, though he didn't know it until now. Elias couldn't resist a wry smile. "I always knew you'd use me as a chew toy." Mera's voice softened. "Better a chew toy than a martyr, Elias. Hold out a little longer. I'm closer than you think." The next day, the alien captains gathered again in their great hall. Their laughter strained as they argued about the static. One claimed it was a trap. Another dismissed it as human desperation. Elias listened, watching their cracks widen. He knew words could be sharper than blades if aimed correctly. When one of them shouted that Earth was a corpse, Elias cleared his throat loudly. They turned on him, sneers ready, but he met their eyes without flinching. "Funny thing about corpses," he said. "They don't usually send greetings." The silence that followed was jagged. A few captains snarled. One threw a goblet at him, but Elias just leaned aside and let it clang against the wall. The seed of doubt had already been planted. He only needed to water it with a grin. Later, Mirror slipped false data into the comms. Orders supposedly from rival fleets arrived, each contradicting the other. Alien captains accused one another of betrayal, hissing and growling in their guttural tongues. Gorgth, the crimson-scaled brute, tried to restore order, but his authority was cracking. Elias leaned back in his chains, savoring the chaos. It was not strength that undid empires. It was paranoia, and paranoia was spreading through the fleet like fire in dry grass. That night, Mara spoke to him again, clearer this time. I sold them a few lies. They'll fight each other soon. Keep pushing. Elias smirked, wincing as he shifted his sore body. Pushing is my specialty. He imagined her rolling her eyes across the void. Just don't get yourself killed before I arrive. He laughed softly. No promises. They shared a brief silence heavy with unspoken history. Years of battles, close calls, arguments that ended in laughter, and sacrifices that nearly broke them. She had faked her death to save him once. Now she was risking everything to bring him back. For the first time since his capture, Elias allowed himself to believe he might actually live. The next day brought a new spectacle. A captain accused another of attempting to sell Elias to a rival empire. The hall erupted in shouts, tusks clashing as accusations flew. Elias sat quietly, chains clinking, eyes half-lidded as though bored. But inside he smiled. Myra's seeds had sprouted. The ghost of soul was real to them now, even if they refused to admit it aloud. And they had no idea how close the ghost truly was. When the guards hauled him back to his cell that evening, Elias leaned against the wall and whispered toward the vent. They're starting to turn on each other. Myra's reply came swift and sure. Good. Let them choke on their own pride. Just a little longer, Elias. Hold out, and when the time is right, we'll burn their empire from the inside out. He closed his eyes, letting her words sink into his bones. For the first time in weeks, sleep came without nightmares. Because now the chains no longer felt like chains. They felt like kindling, and he could already hear the spark catching fire. The alien captains decided that laughter alone was not enough. If the human would not break under ridicule, then he would break under spectacle. They gathered in their arena, a massive chamber carved into the ship's belly, lit by shifting beams that painted the metal floor in harsh crimson and silver. The audience consisted of warriors, lieutenants, and slaves pressed into the stands to watch. At the center stood Elias Cain, still shackled, but forced upright, his chains dragging like iron snakes across the floor. The captains announced the contest as a test of survival. To them, it was entertainment. To Elias, it was a stage. The first beast they unleashed looked like the love child of a gorilla and a scorpion, its multiple limbs clattering against the floor as its mandibles clicked hungrily. The crowd roared, certain that the fragile human would be shredded within minutes. Elias raised his hands, rattling his chains mockingly, and quipped, "This is unfair. I've seen worse at Earth's family reunions." A ripple of laughter, confused and begrudging, passed through the crowd. Even the beast hesitated for a heartbeat, as if sensing its prey was not playing by the rules. The creature lunged, claws snapping. Elias sidestepped, chains scraping as he swung them just enough to trip one of its spindly limbs. The beast stumbled, smashing its mandibles against the wall, and the crowd gasped. Elias, panting, grinned. He was not stronger, but he was quicker and cleverer, and that was enough. When the creature lunged again, he rolled beneath its body, yanking his chain across a joint with a sharp pull. The snap of chitin echoed through the chamber, and the beast screeched, limping backward. Elias raised his shackled wrists and bowed. The crowd's roar was no longer simple amusement. Some of it was respect, reluctant, but real. Captain Gorgth snarled, slamming his claw against the railing. "This is luck," he roared. "The next one will silence him." Another beast was dragged into the pit. This one a lumbering tusked monstrosity with hide thicker than steel. Elias's grin faltered, but only for a moment. As the beast charged, Elias ran, not away, but toward the arena's edge. He vaulted against the wall, let his shackles catch on a protruding beam, and swung himself sideways just as the beast barreled past. It crashed head first into the wall, dazed, while Elias hung there like a battered gymnast. He dropped back to the floor, winded but alive, and muttered loudly enough for the captains to hear, "You should really get a refund on your pets." The crowd erupted again, but this time it was split. Some laughed, others jeered, and a few murmured in tones of unease. A fragile human was not supposed to outwit their gladiatorial monsters. Elias's every sarcastic comment and narrow escape chipped at the myth of alien superiority, and that was exactly what Mara wanted. Her whispers reached him that night through the vents. "Perfect, Elias. Make them doubt. Make them fight each other over whose beasts are the weakest." He chuckled, rubbing the bruises blooming along his ribs. "I nearly died, Mirror." And she replied, "Nearly dying is your specialty." Meanwhile, Mara was weaving her own web. Through the ship's fractured communication network, she planted carefully tailored lies. One captain received a false order that another had claimed sole credit for Elias's capture. Another intercepted a message suggesting their rival planned to sell the human to the highest bidder. Each lie was plausible enough to believe, but poisonous enough to spark suspicion. Soon, captains were snarling in corridors. Warriors were taking sides, and the once unified fleet had fractures deepening with every hour. The breaking point came during a council meeting. A captain with bone-white armor accused his rival of arranging secret negotiations with the Krell Dominion, offering Elias as payment. The accused roared with indignation, swearing on his bloodline that it was a fabrication. Blades were drawn, claws extended, and the council descended into chaos. Elias, chained at the edge of the hall, leaned his head back and laughed. The sound cut through the noise, eerie and sharp. The captains turned toward him with fury in their eyes, but his smirk only deepened. "You don't even need me to destroy you," he said. "You're doing it all on your own." It was Myra's lie, of course, that had sparked the fight, but Elias's words poured fuel on the flames. Paranoia spread like wildfire. Every glance between captains became an accusation. Every delay in orders became a suspected betrayal. And in that chaos, Elias began to notice the guards were less attentive, distracted by whispers of mutiny. He tested his chains, not enough to break them, but enough to feel their weakness growing. That night, Myra's voice came again. "One of them tried to sell you," she said, her tone edged with amusement. "I exposed him mid-negotiation. The whole fleet's at each other's throats now." Elias grinned despite his exhaustion. "You've always had a gift for stirring trouble." She laughed softly. "And you've always had a gift for surviving it." He closed his eyes, savoring the sound of her voice, and replied, "Then let's keep doing what we're best at." The next day, the captains, desperate to reassert control, staged a duel, not between Elias and a beast this time, but between Elias and one of their warriors. They believed this would break the spell he had cast on the crowd. But Elias, though battered and chained, fought not with strength, but with wit. He feigned weakness, stumbled at the right moments, and then turned his opponent's weight against him, sending the alien sprawling to the floor. The crowd gasped, and Elias, panting, whispered just loudly enough for them to hear. "Fragile doesn't mean useless." The warrior rose in shame, glaring at his captains rather than the human. And in that moment, Elias saw the truth. He was no longer just entertainment. He was a fracture line splitting the fleet apart. Myra's lies and his defiance were pushing them to the edge. All that remained was a spark to ignite open conflict. When the duel ended, the Crimson Captain declared Elias would die soon, but his voice lacked conviction. The others looked at him with suspicion, as though he might be hiding something. Elias lowered his gaze, hiding his smirk. The game had changed. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a weapon, and the captains had no idea they had already loaded him into the chamber. Elias Cain knew the time for mocking words and clever sidesteps was running thin. The alien captains were fracturing, their alliances splintering faster than Mara could feed her lies into their comms. But the danger had not lessened. If anything, it had grown sharper. A cornered predator was more dangerous than one at ease, and Elias had spent enough time in cages to recognize the way fear twisted into recklessness. He needed a plan. Something bold enough to keep him alive until Mara arrived in person, and something outrageous enough to exploit the arrogance that was unraveling the fleet from within. The plan began with a whisper, not to Mirror, but to the other captives. Down in the slave decks, creatures from across the galaxy lay chained, beaten, and discarded like broken toys. They had been watching Elias from afar, seeing the human mocked and beaten, yet refusing to break. For them, it was a strange kind of hope. When the guards threw him back into the holding cells after another humiliating display in the arena, Elias leaned close to the creature shackled beside him. A massive reptilian with half an arm missing. He asked quietly if the chains hurt. The reptilian grunted, more out of habit than answer. Elias smirked through the blood on his lips. Good. That means they can be broken. At first the captives thought him mad, but madness was contagious, especially when it came in the form of defiance. Elias began speaking to them at night, weaving stories of Earth's stubbornness, of battles won not with strength, but with refusal to surrender. He joked that humans had once fought wars with spoons and kettles when nothing else was left. The creatures chuckled despite themselves, and slowly the idea of rebellion stopped sounding impossible. By the third night, Elias had a dozen eyes watching him with something other than despair. That was enough. The opportunity arrived in the form of a feast. The captains, desperate to reassert dominance, planned another spectacle, dragging Elias into the grand hall once again. But this time, he feigned weakness more thoroughly than before. He stumbled as though barely able to walk, let his head droop as though exhaustion had finally crushed him. The guards dragged him by his chains like a corpse, laughing at how the once defiant human now looked broken. They did not notice how his eyes flicked toward the vents, or how he brushed his finger lightly against the shard of metal he had pried loose in the cell. Mara had promised a distraction. He only had to play his part. The feast began as usual, filled with the guttural laughter of captains and the stench of their glowing liquor. They mocked him, shoved food in his face, forced him to cough down scraps just for their amusement. Elias gagged and fell to the floor, twitching as if poisoned. The guards panicked, some laughing, some uncertain. Elias's body convulsed violently, then went still. Silence fell like a blade. One captain shouted that the human had died, that he had cheated them of further amusement. Another cursed the cook, accusing him of spoiling the entertainment. Chaos flared as accusations flew. And then, at the perfect moment, the lights flickered. Mara's hand was in the system. The blackout lasted only a few seconds, but that was enough for Elias to spring up from the floor. Chains rattling, shard of metal in his fist. He drove it into the nearest guard's throat, yanking the creature down with a wet gurgle. The hall erupted in screams. Guards lunged, but Elias was already moving, ducking under a blow, swinging his chains like whips. It was clumsy, desperate fighting, but desperation carried a kind of momentum. When the lights flickered again, several guards were on the ground, and Elias was already sprinting for the side doors. He was caught before he reached them. Captain Gorgoth himself stepped into his path, crimson scales glistening under the shifting light. The towering brute snarled, claws outstretched, and roared loud enough to rattle the walls. The hall went silent as he declared that no human would defy him. Elias, panting, chains dripping with blood, looked up with a lopsided grin. "I was hoping you'd say that." The challenge was unmistakable. The duel was inevitable. The arena was hastily prepared, and word spread like wildfire. The human who had mocked them, the one who had survived beasts and warriors, would face Gorgoth himself. Crowds gathered in the stands, tension buzzing like electricity. Elias's body screamed with pain, bruises blooming everywhere, ribs aching with each breath, but his mind was sharp. He knew he could not match Gorgoth's brute strength. But arrogance was heavier than muscle, and he was ready to use it. The duel began with a charge. Gorgoth moved like a thunderclap, claws slashing for Elias's head. Elias rolled aside, chains clattering, narrowly avoiding death. The crowd gasped, the sound echoing like waves. Gorgoth snarled, swinging again, this time catching Elias across the chest and sending him sprawling. Pain flared white-hot, but Elias forced himself to laugh, spitting blood onto the floor. "You swing like my grandmother," he wheezed. The crowd roared with mixed laughter and outrage. Gorgoth's eyes burned with fury. He struck again, faster, harder, but Elias ducked under the blow, wrapping his chain around one of the captain's thick arms. Using every ounce of his weight, Elias yanked, twisting Gorgoth's momentum against him. The mass of aliens stumbled, crashing into the wall. The crowd erupted again, some laughing, others shouting in disbelief. The duel became a dance of rage and cunning. Gorgth unleashed blow after blow, each one strong enough to crush Elias if it connected. But Elias darted, dodged, used the chains to tangle his opponent's limbs, to pull him off balance, to make him look clumsy before his peers. Every sarcastic comment, every mocking grin chipped at the captain's pride. Finally, Elias saw the opening. Gorgth lunged with both claws, aiming to end it. Elias sidestepped at the last second, looping the chain around the alien's leg and yanking hard. The captain toppled with a crash that shook the arena. Before he could rise, Elias planted a boot on his chest and raised the bloody chain high. The crowd froze. Breathless, battered, Elias shouted, "This is your champion! This is the strength you mock me with!" He laughed then, wild and unbroken. And for the first time, some in the crowd laughed with him. The seed had sprouted. The mighty captain, humiliated by a shackled human, was not just a spectacle anymore. It was a symbol. When the duel ended, Elias was dragged back to his cell, but he walked taller despite the pain. Myra's voice reached him later that night. "You did it, Elias. You broke him." He leaned back against the wall, chains rattling softly. "No," he whispered. "We broke them." The fleet was cracking, and soon it would shatter. All that remained was the strike Mirror had promised. The shackles around his wrists no longer felt like chains. They felt like the beginnings of a crown. The moment Elias had been waiting for came in silence, not in the roar of a crowd or the clamor of chains, but in a stillness so sudden it felt unnatural. He woke in his cell to find the hum of the ship's engines dampened. The lights dimmed to an uncertain glow. Something in the air shifted. A pressure change that made his ears ring. Then he heard it. A sound buried beneath the ventilation hum. A rhythm his heart recognized before his mind could name it. A docking seal. Mara was here. The guards reacted before Elias could savor the thought. Alarms screeched through the corridors as reports came in of a breach. The captains roared at one another, their paranoia exploding into accusations. Some shouted that the Krell Dominion had attacked. Others swore it was sabotage from within. None of them wanted to admit the simplest truth, that Earth's ghost had come to claim her own. When the doors to the holding cells burst open, Elias expected guards with blades and plasma rifles. Instead, he saw her. Mirror Solari stood in the doorway, dressed in a combat suit, black as deep space, her helmet tucked under one arm, her face lit by the flickering red of the alarms. Her hair was shorter than when he had last seen her, her eyes sharper, but her smirk was exactly as he remembered it. "I told you not to get yourself killed," she said. Elias let out a ragged laugh, rising slowly from the floor despite the chains. "And miss this dramatic entrance? Not a chance." For a heartbeat, their reunion was a stolen moment of humor, fragile and sharp against the chaos unfolding outside. She cut his chains with a hiss of plasma, and the weight that had dragged on him for weeks clattered to the floor. His wrists burned where the shackles had dug in, but he flexed his hands with a grin. "Never thought I'd miss having circulation." Mara handed him a sidearm, small compared to the weapons the aliens wielded, but it felt like freedom itself in his palm. Together they moved through the corridors, Mirror guiding him with precision, Elias following with a mixture of relief and disbelief. For years he had thought her gone, another casualty in the endless war. Yet here she was, alive, solid, and still carrying the same reckless fire that had drawn him to her in the first place. They didn't get far before the alien captains regrouped. The ship's corridors rang with the pounding of boots and the guttural shouts of warriors rallying to their commanders. The fleet was in disarray, but desperation united them against the sudden terrifying truth. Humanity was not finished. They stormed through the halls, blades and rifles flashing in the strobing red lights. Mara and Elias fought side by side, weaving through cover, firing at weak points in alien armor, cutting down anyone who blocked their path. The air filled with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Every kill felt less like victory and more like necessity, a reminder that survival was always a razor's edge. Word spread fast. Half the captains demanded Elias and Myra's immediate execution, shouting for unity against the humans. The other half hesitated, torn by suspicion that their rivals had engineered this chaos. Some captains even began whispering offers of alliance, desperate to save their hides now that the legend of the Ghost of Souls stood breathing before them. The great hall, once a place of mocking laughter, became a battlefield of words. Accusations flew like arrows, and old grudges resurfaced in the heat of the moment. Myra's plan had worked better than either of them had dared to dream. The fleet was eating itself alive, but chaos was not victory. When the debate collapsed into violence, entire crews turned on each other, ships firing across the void, even as they orbited dangerously close. Mirror pulled Elias to the observation deck where they watched through the reinforced glass as alien vessels exchanged barrages. Explosions flared against the backdrop of Saturn's rings. The battlefield illuminated by the reflection of shattered hulls and dying stars. Elias exhaled in awe even as his chest ached from bruises and exhaustion. "You did it, Mirror," he whispered. "You turned them on themselves." Mara shook her head. "No, Elias. We did. They mocked you, and you never stopped laughing. That was the spark. I just fanned it into flame." The celebration was short-lived. Gorgoth, crimson and monstrous, was not beaten yet. He stormed onto the deck, his scaled armor slick with blood, his eyes burning with fury. "Traitorous wretches!" he bellowed at his fellow captains. "You let these vermin poison your minds. I will crush them myself." He charged, claws raised. Mara fired, but his armor absorbed the blast. Elias dove aside, dragging her with him as Gorgotha's strike split the deck where they had stood a heartbeat before. The duel had returned. Only now Elias was no longer chained, and Mara fought beside him. The battle was brutal. Gorgoth was larger, stronger, and unyielding. But Elias had learned the captain's arrogance, his blind spots, his reliance on brute force. Together, he and Mirror wove around the giant. Mirror firing to drive him back while Elias struck with quick, precise blows. Every step was a gamble, every breath a risk, but they moved with the rhythm of old partners, each instinctively covering the other. Finally, as Gorgoth lunged with both claws, Elias hooked his arm around the captain's neck while Mara planted a charge at his feet. They hurled themselves clear just as the explosive detonated, engulfing the crimson captain in fire. His roar shook the deck before it was drowned in the collapse of steel and flame. There was no time to revel in victory. Outside, the battle raged. Mara activated her comms, and a moment later, the vigilant dawn decloaked from the shadow of Titan. The Earth ship was small compared to the alien cruisers, but it was fierce, armed with weapons salvaged and re-engineered from a dozen battlefields. Its appearance stunned the fleets already tearing themselves apart. Some captains screamed that it was a trick. Others turned their guns on the vigilant dawn in a frenzy. But Myra's voice carried steady through the chaos. "This is for Earth," she said into the comms, her words broadcast across every frequency. "You thought us finished. You thought us broken. But humanity is not ashes. Humanity is fire." The vigilant dawn unleashed its barrage, carving through alien ships with relentless precision. Explosions bloomed across the void, scattering debris into the rings of Saturn. Elias, leaning against the railing, watched with weary awe as the tide turned. He was no longer a prisoner, no longer a spectacle. He was a soldier again, and beside him stood the partner who had always been his equal, his anchor and his spark. The battle was far from over, but the empire that had mocked him was crumbling before his eyes. The shackled man had become the weapon they had feared most. The aftermath of the battle was chaos painted across the stars. Alien ships floated, broken, spilling fire and debris into the void. Saturn's rings glimmered with the reflection of shattered hulls and burning wreckage. From the observation deck, Elias Cain pressed a bloodied hand against the glass, watching it all unfold with a strange mixture of triumph and disbelief. Only hours ago, he had been a chained prisoner mocked as Earth's weakest son. Now he stood unshackled with Mirror Solari at his side, and the fleet that once jeered at him lay in ruins of its own making. Yet victory was not assured. Gorgotha's death had not silenced the others. It had only thrown them into greater frenzy. Half the fleet still fought, desperate to erase the humiliation of losing to a human. The other half splintered, captains turning weapons on former allies in desperate bids for survival. The war they had tried to amuse themselves with had become the trap Mara had promised. Elias's body screamed for rest, but adrenaline kept him moving. He followed Mara through the wreckage-strewn corridors toward the ship's command deck, fighting off stragglers who tried to stop them. The alien technology was alien indeed, yet Mara navigated with the precision of someone who had studied every flaw in their systems. She rerouted security, locked down bulkheads, and sowed chaos as though conducting an orchestra. Elias marveled at her composure, though he could see the exhaustion etched into her face. The tightness around her eyes that betrayed how much this victory was costing her. Still, she pressed on, as relentless as the void outside. When they reached the command deck, Elias froze. Through the wide viewport, the vigilant dawn burned bright against the backdrop of Saturn, its guns hammering relentlessly. Alien ships closed in, swarming like predators. And even Myra's ship could not last forever. The deck's consoles flickered with data in alien script, reports of mutinies, betrayals, and pleas for reinforcements that would never come. Captains screamed over comms, their unity shattered, their pride bleeding out with every casualty. Elias stepped forward, dragging his aching body to the center of the room, and stared out at the stars. For the first time in weeks, his voice carried not as a joke or a jab, but as something heavier. "You wanted me shackled," he said quietly, as though speaking to the stars themselves. "You thought chains meant I was powerless. But you never understood. Chains only remind us how sweet freedom tastes when we break them." The few alien officers who remained on the deck shifted uneasily, their weapons half raised, uncertain if they should kill him or listen. Mara stood at his side, her presence a warning and a promise. Elias turned toward them, voice rising now. "Look outside. Look at your fleets. You mocked me because I was human, because I was fragile, because I bled, but look at you now. Bleeding, breaking, tearing each other apart. You call us weak, but we endure. You call us fools, but we outlast you. That is why you fear us. Because no matter how many chains you forge, we find a way to laugh in your faces and break them." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the command deck. Then one of the officers, scarred and beaten, dropped his weapon. Another followed. Not all, but enough. Pride fractured in them as it had in their captains, and Elias saw the spark of doubt ignite again. He did not need them all. He only needed enough to let fear spread on its own. Mirror stepped forward, seizing the console, broadcasting across every frequency in the fleet. Her voice rang cold and steady. "This is over. Your empire fed on humiliation, and now you choke on it. Surrender or burn in the ashes you made." The words echoed across the void, carried into the ears of every captain, still clinging to their arrogance. But arrogance dies slowly. One by one, ships broke formation, either fleeing into the black or firing blindly in rage. The vigilant dawn pressed its advantage, its guns tearing through the stragglers. Yet amidst the carnage, one massive flagship remained, its silhouette vast against the rings of Saturn. It did not flee, did not falter. Its cannons flared, hammering Myra's ship with relentless force. Sparks burst across the vigilant dawn's hull. Elias. And with that, we have reached the end of the story, but stories don't end here. If you like the story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel so you receive all the new content. And if you have an opinion or something that caught your attention, leave a comment and let's discuss together. I'm waiting for your opinions, and see you in the next story. Bye.